Committee will come to order. I would like to thank Ranking Member Portman, Chairwoman Klobuchar, Ranking Member Blunt, and all of our colleagues from the Rules Committee for your leadership and your help in putting together this joint meeting here today and hearing today. I'd also like to thank our witnesses for joining us today and for your service to our country. For many Americans, this will be the first opportunity to hear about what happened in the Capitol on January 6th directly from our witnesses. We appreciate your willingness to work with our committees to examine the breakdowns that allowed this terrible attack to occur and to ensure that an attack like this can never, ever happen again. This hearing is unique because it's personal for everyone involved, and I'm grateful to our witnesses, colleagues, staff, Capitol Police, the D.C. Metropolitan Police, and the National Guard units who continue to assist in protecting the Capitol today, and for all of the hard work that allows this very important discussion to begin. So I would like to once again thank Chairwoman Klobuchar for your partnership and for your leadership, and look forward to your opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Chairman Peters, and good morning. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today for this first joint hearing of the Rules Committee and the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee as we work to conduct oversight into what happened in the lead up and during the horrific events of January 6th. Thank you to Chairman Peters and also Ranking Member Portman, as well as my good friend Senator Blunt, who I look forward to continue working with on the Rules Committee in this Congress. I think it's important to note that we planned this entire hearing on a bipartisan basis. That's because the stakes are so high, and we want this, and I say this to our witnesses as well, who are all appearing here voluntarily. I think it's important for the members to know that, and we thank them for doing that. We want this to be as constructive as possible, because in order to figure out the solutions, so this doesn't happen again, we must have the facts, and the answers are in this room. When an angry, violent mob staged an insurrection on January 6th and desecrated our Capitol, the temple of our democracy, it was not just an attack on the building, it was an attack on our republic itself. We are here today to better understand what was known in advance, what steps were taken to secure the Capitol, and what occurred that day, because we want to ensure that nothing like this happens again. Each of our witnesses held a leadership role at the time of the attack. Acting Chief Robert Conte of the Metropolitan Police Department of the District of Columbia, Mr. Stephen Sun, former Chief of the U.S. Capitol Police, who is here with us in person today, Mr. Michael Stenger, former Senate Sergeant at Arms, and Mr. Paul Irving, former House Sergeant at Arms. The other witnesses are here, as many of our witnesses do, via video. To our witnesses, your testimony is vital, and thank you again for coming. At the same time, this is certainly not the last hearing that we will have regarding this attack. Next week, we will hear from witnesses from federal agencies, including the FBI, the Department of Homeland Security, and the Department of Defense, that are critical to our understanding. The insurrection at the Capitol was more than an assault on democracy. It was an actual life or death situation for the many brave law enforcement officers who show up here to do their work every day. And at the beginning of this testimony, we will hear from one of them. We will never forget the haunting shrieks of the police officer pinned in between the doors at the hands of the rioters pleading for help. We will never forget Officer Harry Dunn, who fought against the violent mob for hours, and after it was over, broke down in tears, telling fellow officers he'd been called the N-word 15 times that day. He asked, "Is this America?" Our Officer Eugene Goodman, who after saving Senator Romney from walking, who is here with us today, thank you, Senator Romney, from walking directly into the mob, ran by himself to take on a group of rioters. And then Eugene Goodman diverted that mob away from the Senate chamber, allowing us to safely depart. Tragically, the attack on the Capitol also cost the lives of 3 brave officers, including Officer Brian Sicknick, who died from injuries sustained while engaging with protesters. 2 other officers died by suicide following the event of January 6th. D.C. Metropolitan Police Officer Jeffrey Smith and U.S. Capitol Police Officer Howard Liebengood. Officer Liebengood, or Howie to those who knew him, worked the Delaware Avenue door of the Russell Senate office building, someone who I've seen at that doorway and who always greeted me and everyone with a warm smile. It has been reported that 140 U.S. Capitol Police officers sustained injuries from defending the Capitol. The courage of these officers will be remembered forever, but there are still many voices that we haven't heard in the stories of January 6, including the many staff who make sure we have food in our cafeteria and water and heat in our building. One janitorial worker hid during the attack in a closet. Another custodial staff member reflected on how terrible he felt when he had to clean up feces and had been smeared on the wall, saying, "I felt bad, I felt degraded." These dedicated workers were here too when the Capitol was attacked, as were many committed journalists who report on our work to the American people. To make this place safe going forward, we must answer some key questions. First and foremost on many of our minds is what took so long to deploy the National Guard that day, both because of decisions made in the Capitol complex, but also by others in the federal government. We must find out what was known about the potential for violence before the attack and how that intelligence was shared with law enforcement partners, including the officials responsible for protecting the Capitol. There are also important questions to be asked about how information concerning those threats was communicated to rank-and-file officers. And it's vital that we explore necessary reforms to the structure of the Capitol Police Board, which I know we will hear more about today. We owe it to the 140 Capitol Police officers injured and to all those at the Capitol who continue to suffer the repercussions. We owe it to the officer beaten by the violent rioters because he literally placed his body in the doorway to protect us. We owe it to the officers who lost their lives. We owe it to the American people to figure out how the United States Capitol, the preeminent symbol of democracy around the world, could be overtaken by an angry, violent mob. And we owe it to ourselves, colleagues, to believe enough in our democracy and in the U.S. Senate that despite our political differences, we will be constructive in this hearing today, not just here to make political hay, but be constructive today to figure out what went wrong and what changes we can make to ensure that the Capitol is safe for us and the public going forward. Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Blunt, Ranking Member Portman, and colleagues, for me, the bottom line is that we must get the answers, and those answers are what will give us the solutions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, it's been just over 6 weeks since our nation watched with horror as our Capitol building was breached by domestic terrorists who sought to use violence and intimidation to overturn the results of a free and fair election. This was a shocking assault on our democracy, and it marked one of our nation's darkest days. The United States has stood as a beacon for the world, showing how democracy can thrive. On January 6th, we saw just how fragile many of our most valued democratic principles, including the peaceful transfer of power, is. It's hard to express how deeply grateful we are for the actions our Capitol Police, our sergeants at arms, and other law enforcement agencies do to keep us safe every single day, and especially on that day. Too many of our officers were gravely injured or tragically killed as they bravely fought back the attackers. Chief Conte, we are also indebted to the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department for their valiant efforts to thwart the attack. D.C. Police often provides support to help secure the Capitol, but the officers under your command did not hesitate to come to our aid. We are thankful for the heroic actions of so many who ensured this direct attack on our democracy failed. But there's no question that there were colossal breakdowns in the intelligence gathering and security preparations leading up to the events of January 6th, as well as during the coordination and response efforts once the attack got underway. Our goal today is to begin to understand where those breakdowns and failures occurred, and to determine if there are policy and structural changes Congress must make to prevent a future attack of this nature. In my role on the Homeland Security Committee, I've worked to draw attention to the rising threat of domestic terrorism, including the rise of insidious ideologies of white supremacy, anti-government militias, and now QAnon conspiracies. These ideologies are intertwined in numerous ways, and on January 6, we saw just how quickly they can shift from online communities to committing organized, violent attacks in the real world. But the warning signs were there. Just a few months earlier in my home state of Michigan, law enforcement successfully stopped a plot by anti-government militias to kidnap our state's governor. We've seen an increase in violent crimes over the last decade that are driven by hateful ideologies. And we saw the deadly and tragic consequences on January 6 when the domestic terrorist threat was not taken as seriously as it should have been. This is a systemic and leadership failure on the part of our security officials, from the FBI and Department of Homeland Security to the security leadership on the ground in Capitol, and it must be addressed. Domestic terrorism is not a new threat, but it is an urgent threat. It will require serious focus to ensure that we are doing everything we can to protect the safety and security of all Americans. And I'd like to take a moment to remind my colleagues that every senator here today took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, both foreign and domestic. As the committees charged with oversight, strengthening Homeland Security, and maintaining Capitol operations, we have a solemn duty to thoroughly examine the security breakdowns and make needed reforms. And I'm hopeful we'll be able to work together and carry out this responsibility in a serious and a nonpartisan way. And finally, while today's hearing is our first on January 6th attack, it will not be our last. We will continue to seek testimony and information from a range of agencies and officials who were involved in preparing for and responding to the events of the day for the U.S. Capitol and for the entire region. The attack on January 6th was an extraordinary event that requires exhaustive consideration. The American people deserve answers on why their Capitol was breached. And I look forward to having a productive discussion with our witnesses in order to provide the American people with those answers. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Good. Senator Blunt.
Thank you, Chairwoman Klobuchar. It's great to work with you and Chairman Peters and Senator Portman as we move forward on this hearing on what happened on January the 6th, and I think that'll obviously also require discussion of what happened in the days immediately leading up to January the 6th. This hearing, as Senator Peters and you have both said, really the beginning of a series of efforts that hopefully we can approach in a bipartisan way that looks for solutions and ensures that the deadly, outrageous, destructive attack that marks such a sad day in our history never happens again. Certainly the officers who defended the Capitol that day deserve to be recognized and praised for their valiant efforts and their willingness every day to stand ready to do what needs to be done to defend the Capitol and those who work there. I'm certainly grateful to them. I'm particularly grateful in this instance to the Metropolitan Police Department and their really admirable response to be here quickly, to be here with significant numbers of people in the very short term, and within an hour to have an incredible impact on what was going on here at the Capitol in a positive way. The failures of the day, unfortunately, were of the most serious kind. Senator Klobuchar has already mentioned the 3 officers whose lives were lost and other officers who have really had to deal with this in a significant way. You also have to remember that this was an event where the families of our officers were watching in real time on television in an attack where they're seeing people that mean the entire world to them in this fight for their lives and fight for our lives and the Capitol. Three of today's witnesses, former House Sergeant-at-Arms Irving, former Senate Sergeant-at-Arms Stenger, and former Chief of the United States Police, Capitol Police Son, were all charged with the protection of the Capitol on January the 6th. We need to hear from them whether it was a failure of imagination of what could go wrong, a failure of intelligence gathering and dissemination, a failure of preparation, which ultimately led to this problem, or maybe a structural failure that just is not designed in a way that it allows us to respond to an immediate crisis, and obviously we need to get that done. I want to hear from Chief Conte of the Metropolitan Police Department to learn about the department's role and frankly to learn how their decision-making process appeared to be so much quicker than the decision-making process we could go through here. I believe it's important for everyone to note that the attacks on January the 6th did not prevent Congress from fulfilling its responsibilities. Both chambers reconvened that evening and finished the certification of the results of the Electoral College. I think Senator Klobuchar and the Vice President and I left the building about 4 a.m. On Friday morning, but we did get our work done where the American people and people all over the world would have expected it to get done. And then on the 20th, we held an inauguration on the same platform that had been stormed 3 weeks earlier and 2 weeks earlier, and carried out one of our most important aspects of our democracy, the peaceful transfer of power. I want to thank my colleagues from both the Homeland Security and Rules Committee for today's hearing and the staff work that's gone into getting ready for today.
Ranking Member Portman.
Thank you, Chairman Peters, Chairwoman Klobuchar, Ranking Member Blunt, for the constructive comments this morning. In this business, you often finish like you start, and I appreciate the fact that we're starting this review by taking the politics out of it so we can get to the bottom of what happened. I want to start by expressing my gratitude on behalf of everybody for the men and women of law enforcement, U.S. Capitol Police, Secret Service, National Guard, Metropolitan Police Department, the FBI, and all the law enforcement agencies who put their safety on the line to safeguard democracy on January 6th. As I said on the Senate floor that night, it was thanks to them that Vice President Pence, members of Congress, staff, and the Capitol Complex workforce were protected, and we were able to complete our constitutional duty of certifying the election. It was important, in my view, that we sent a clear message that night to our constituents and to the world that we would not be intimidated, that the mob would not rule here. But that message could not have been delivered without law enforcement securing us and our respective chambers. 7 individuals lost their lives as a result of the Capitol attack, including 2 Capitol Police officers and a D.C. Metropolitan Police Department officer. We will never forget the service and sacrifice of Officers Brian Sicknick, Jeffrey Smith, Howard Liebengood. I knew Officer Liebengood. I saw Howie most days at his post at the Russell office building. His colleagues will tell you no officer was more dedicated to the mission of the Capitol Hill Police Department, the mission and duty to serve and protect, and I'm proud to have called him a friend. We will never forget Officer Eugene Goodman and the hundreds of other officers who were heroes on the front lines that afternoon, that evening, many of whom sustained injuries. To honor that kind of sacrifice and avoid future attacks, we have got to take a really hard look at what happened on January 6th. The decision-making that led up to that day and the decision-making that allowed the Capitol to be breached and overrun. As the Bipartisan Media Advisory announcing this joint hearing stated, the purpose today is to examine the security failures that led to a breach of the Capitol on January 6th, specifically the preparation and response efforts. There are key questions that have to be answered. First, some witnesses have suggested there was an intelligence failure. We need to know, was there credible intelligence about potential violence? When was it known, and who knew it? Second, our witnesses have differing accounts about requests for National Guard assistance. We need to know, did the U.S. Capitol Police request approval to seek National Guard assistance prior to January 6th? And if so, why was that request denied? We need to know, was the request for National Guard assistance on January 6th delayed? And why, if that is true? And we need to know why it took so long for the National Guard to arrive after their support was requested. Third, the Capitol was overtaken in a matter of hours. We need to know whether Capitol police officers were properly trained and equipped to respond to an attack on the Capitol. And if not, why not? And we need to know why the Capitol complex itself was so vulnerable and insecure that it could be so easily overrun. My hope is that today we get clear answers to these questions from our witnesses. We need to know what happened and how to ensure this never happens again. It's that simple. I'll be listening carefully, as I know my colleagues will, to the testimony of the witnesses before us. These events on January 6th showed that while our democracy is resilient, our democracy at times will be challenged. We've got to be up to that challenge. That certainly includes securing this Capitol, the citadel of democracy. That's something we can all agree on. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Portman. Before I introduce the panel, it's important that we hear from someone. We all believed it was important that we hear from someone who was on the front lines that day. And I'd like to recognize Captain Carnicia Mendoza of the U.S. Capitol Police. Captain Mendoza has been a member of the Capitol Police for almost 19 years with 13 years of leadership experience. She currently serves as a field commander in the Special Operations Division, where her duties include acting as a field commander for significant security incidents. She has served in various divisions within the department, including the Command Center, House Division, and Senate Division. Before she joined the Capitol Police, she served as an active duty soldier in the United States Army, and she has received various awards for her work, including her work on recovery efforts during the Pentagon attack on 9/11. Born and raised in Missouri, Senator Blunt, Captain Mendoza graduated from Park University with a Bachelor of Science in Criminal Justice Administration. She has 2 children. On January 6, she rushed to the Capitol when she heard that her fellow officers needed immediate help and assumed command in the rotunda as she and her colleagues fought to push back the rioters and ultimately drive them out of the building. Captain, thank you for sharing your story today.
Thank you. Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to speak before the committee today, and thank you all for your service to our country. My name is Captain Carnicia Mendoza, and I've served with the United States Capitol Police for 19 years. I take a lot of pride in my job. Prior to serving with the Capitol Police, I served as an active duty soldier with the United States Army. My last duty station was split between the Pentagon and the Washington Area Criminal Investigations Division. I received various awards from the Army and the Capitol Police, to include an award for recovery efforts during the Pentagon attack. Unfortunately, I didn't save any lives, but there are certain lessons that always stuck with me after 9/11. One of those lessons is knowing the unthinkable is always possible, so be ready. So I always take my job very seriously, as 9/11 is always in the back of my mind. With the Capitol Police, I have served in various operational, administrative, and collateral assignments. I'm currently serving as a captain in the Special Operations Division, where I have various responsibilities to include serving as a field commander and a field force commander for the Civil Disturbance Unit. Throughout my career, I have responded to and managed various critical incidents and events, from congressional and member security-related issues to shootings and armed carjackings. I have served as a CDU field force commander for multiple events, including the November 14th Million MAGA March. In my career, I've been activated to work demonstrations with various controversial groups, and I've been called some of the worst names so many times that I'm pretty numb to it now. As an agency, we have trained for and handled numerous demonstrations. It's something we do on a regular basis, and it's something I've always felt we've excelled at. During the Million MAGA March, multiple white supremacist groups, to include the Proud Boys and others, converged on the Supreme Court along with countergroups. The Civil Disturbance Unit fought hard that day, physically breaking up fights and separating various groups. I literally woke up the next day unable to move due to the pain. On January 6th, we anticipated an event similar to the Million MAGA March that took place on November 14th, where we would likely face groups fighting among one another. Additional civil disturbance units were activated that day. I was working the evening shift and had planned to report in at 3 p.m. I was prepared to work a 16-hour shift and assume field force commanders should the event continue into the evening and overnight shifts. It was approximately 1:30 in the afternoon. I was home eating with my 10-year-old, spending time with him before what I knew would be a long day, when a fellow captain contacted me and told me things were bad and that I needed to respond in. I literally dropped everything to respond to work that day early. I arrived within 15 minutes and I contacted dispatch to ask her what active scenes we had. I was advised things were pretty bad. I asked where assistance was needed and was advised of 6 active scenes. There was an explosive device at the Democratic National Committee building, a second explosive device at the Republican National Committee building, and large hostile groups at different locations outside the Capitol building. I advised the dispatcher I would respond to the DNC since that building was closest to where I was at the time. En route, I heard officers at the Capitol building calling for immediate assistance, so I proceeded past the DNC to the Capitol. As I arrived to the East Front Plaza of the Capitol, I heard an officer yell there was a breach at the rotunda door, and I heard various officers calling for assistance at multiple locations throughout the building. Many of the doors to the building were not accessible due to the size of the crowd. I was able to enter a lower-level door with the assistance of a Capitol Division officer. Once inside the memorial door, I immediately noticed a large crowd of possibly 200 rioters yelling in front of me. Since I was alone, I turned to go back so I could enter another door, but within the few seconds it took me to walk back to the door I entered, there were already countless rioters outside the building banging on the door. I had no choice but to proceed through the violent crowd in the building. I made my way through the crowd by yelling and pushing people out of my way until I saw Capitol Police civil disturbance units in riot gear in the hallway. They were holding the hallway to keep rioters from penetrating deeper into the building. I immediately jumped in line with them to assist with holding the crowd of rioters. At some point, my right arm got wedged between rioters and the railing along the wall. A CDU sergeant pulled my right arm free, and had he not, I'm certain it would have been broken. Shortly after that, an officer was pushed and fell to the floor. I assisted the officer to a safer location and got back in line. At some point, the crowd breached the line officers worked so hard to maintain. Civil disturbance units began to redeploy to keep rioters from accessing other areas of the building. I proceeded to the rotunda where I noticed a heavy smoke-like residue and smelled what I believed to be military-grade CS gas, a familiar smell. It was mixed with fire extinguisher spray deployed by rioters. The rioters continued to deploy CS into the rotunda. Officers received a lot of gas exposure, which is worse inside the building than outside because there's nowhere for it to go. I received chemical burns to my face that still have not healed to this day. I witnessed officers being knocked to the ground and hit with various objects that were thrown by rioters. I was unable to determine exactly what those objects were. I immediately assumed command in the rotunda and called for additional assets. Officers began to push the crowd out the door. After a couple hours, officers cleared the rotunda, but had to physically hold the door closed because it had been broken by the rioters. Officers begged me for relief as they were unsure how long they could physically hold the door closed, with the crowd continually banging on the outside of the door, attempting to gain re-entry. Eventually, officers were able to secure the door with furniture and other objects. I'm proud of the officers I worked with on January 6th. They fought extremely hard. I know some said the battle lasted 3 hours, but according to my Fitbit, I was in the exercise zone for 4 hours and 9 minutes, and many officers were in the fight even before I arrived. I'm extremely proud of the United States Capitol Police. I'm especially proud of the officers who are the backbone of this agency and carry out day-to-day operations. I know with teamwork we can move forward. The night of January 7th into the very early morning hours of my birthday, January 8th, I spent at the hospital comforting the family of our fallen officer and met with the medical examiner's office prior to working with fellow officers to facilitate a motorcade to transport Officer Sicknick from the hospital. Of the multitude of events I've worked in my nearly 19-year career in the department, this was by far the worst of the worst. We could have had 10 times the amount of people working with us, and I still believe the battle would have been just as devastating. As an American and as an Army veteran, it's sad to see us attacked by our fellow citizens. I'm sad to see the unnecessary loss of life. I'm sad to see the impact this has had on Capitol Police officers. And I'm sad to see the impact this has had on our agency and on our country. Although things are still raw and moving forward will be a difficult process, I look forward to moving forward together as an agency and as a country. In closing, I want to honor Chief Sun's leadership. I served under his command as a watch commander for 3 years and was able to personally see his hard work and dedication. He was fully dedicated to the United States Capitol Police, and he cared about every employee on the department. I often hear employees on the department praise his leadership and his ability to inspire others. He's made a significant impact on our agency. Thank you, Chief. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Captain Mendoza, for that beautiful statement and for your work on behalf of our country. I'm going to give you the bios on the other witnesses, and then Senator Peters will swear them in. Our first witness today is Robert J. Conte, Acting Chief of the Metropolitan Police Department of the District of Columbia. Acting Chief Conte was sworn in as Acting Chief of the MPD on January 2nd of this year. He first joined the department in 1989 as a cadet. After being sworn in, he became a patrol officer before being promoted to lieutenant and leading the force's intelligence branch. In 2004, he was promoted to captain and put in charge of the violent crimes branch. After being promoted to 2nd District Commander, he joined the Special Operations Division. For the next decade, Acting Chief Conte served in multiple leadership roles with the MPD, including as Patrol Chief of Patrol Services South, where he oversaw several police districts. He was appointed as Assistant Chief of the Investigative Services Bureau in March of 2018. Acting Chief Conte is a graduate of DC schools and holds a bachelor degree in professional studies from the George Washington University. Acting Chief Conte grew up in the Carver Terrace community in Northeast Washington, D.C. Our second witness today will be Mr. Stephen A. Sund. Mr. Sund served as Chief of the U.S. Capitol Police from June of 2019 to January 16th of this year. Mr. Sund joined the Capitol Police in 2017 as Assistant Chief and Chief of Operations. Prior to joining the USCP, he spent nearly 25 years with the Metropolitan Police Department, where he started out as a patrol officer in 1990. From 1999 to 2006, he served as MPD's Special Operations Division and helped plan several major events, including the 2001 and 2005 presidential inaugurations. After joining the MPD's Homeland Security Division, he rose through the ranks to become commander of the Special Operations Division in 2011. As commander of the Special Operations Division, he served as lead planner for both the 2009 and 2013 presidential inaugurations and many other national security special events. He received his Bachelor and Master of Science degrees from Johns Hopkins and his Master of Arts in Homeland Security from the Naval Postgraduate School. Our third witness will be Mr. Michael Stanger, former Senate Sergeant at Arms, who served in that capacity from April of 2018 through January 7th of this year. He joined the Senate in 2011 as Assistant Sergeant at Arms for the Office of Protective Services and Continuity. He has also served as Chief of Staff of the Sergeant at Arms and as Deputy Sergeant of Arms. Prior to joining the Sergeant at Arms office, he was a 35-year veteran of the United States Secret Service, where he served in many roles, including as the special agent in charge of the Washington Field Office. Immediately before joining the Senate, he served as Assistant Director of the Office of Government and Public Affairs for the Secret Service. He graduated from Fairleigh Dickinson University. He is also a veteran, having attained the rank of captain in the U.S. Marine Corps. Our final witness today is Mr. Paul Irving. Mr. Irving served as a Sergeant at Arms at the U.S. House of Representatives from January of 2012 through January 7th of this year. He joined the United States Secret Service in 1983 after briefly serving with the FBI. He served as head legal instructor for constitutional law and criminal procedure at the Secret Service Training Academy before joining the Presidential Protective Division during the George H.W. Bush and Clinton administrations. Following his White House service, he served as the Assistant Director for Congressional Affairs, Assistant Director for Government Affairs, Assistant Director for Homeland Security, and Assistant Director for Administration for the Secret Service. He retired from the Secret Service in 2008 as Assistant Director and worked as a private security consultant until his appointment as House Sergeant at Arms in 2012. He is a graduate of the American University and Whittier Law School. I want to thank our witnesses for appearing voluntarily today, and I look forward to your testimony.
It is the practice of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee to swear in witnesses. So if the witnesses would stand, including those joining us virtually, and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony you will give before this committee shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. May all be seated.
You want to begin then, Chief Conte?
Sure. Good morning, Chairman Peters, Chairwoman Klobuchar, Ranking Members Portman and Blunt, and members of the committee. I am Robert J. Conte III, the Acting Chief of Police of the Metropolitan Police Department, the primary police force in the District of Columbia. I appreciate this opportunity to brief you on the events of January 6, 2021, a dark day for our country. I would like to begin by highlighting a few key facts to ensure the committees and the audience understand the very different roles of Mayor Muriel Bowser and the District of Columbia, including MPD, and those of congressional and federal authorities. First, MPD is prohibited by federal law from entering the Capitol or its grounds to patrol, make arrests, or serve warrants without the consent or request of the Capitol Police Board. Second, the President of the United States, not the Mayor of the District of Columbia, controls the DC National Guard. The scope of the request by the Mayor must be limited to supporting the district's local jurisdiction and authority, which excludes federal entities and property. Third, since Mayor Bowser declared a public health emergency last March, the district has not issued permits for any large gathering. Although the district and MPD take pride in facilitating the exercise of First Amendment rights by all groups, regardless of their beliefs, none of the public gatherings on January 5th and 6th were issued permits by the city. On the morning of January 6th, MPD was prepared to support our federal partners with a First Amendment assembly that was held primarily on federal land, while continuing to patrol and respond to calls for service throughout DC. Based on our experience with prior demonstrations after the election, we recognize that there was a possibility of violence, especially after dark as smaller groups of protesters gathered with malicious intent on our city streets. To be clear, available intelligence pointed to a large presence of some of the same groups that had contributed to violence in the city after demonstrations in November and December. The district had intelligence indicating the potential for violent actions in the streets of the District of Columbia. In preparation for the anticipated demonstrations and the possibility of violence on city streets, MPD was fully deployed on 12-hour shifts the week of January 4th, with days off and leave canceled. At Mayor Bowser's request, several area police departments were on standby in DC, and more than 300 members of the National Guard were deployed on district streets, providing traffic control and other services. However, these resources were barely enough to counter an event that had never happened in the history of the United States: a mob of thousands of American citizens launching a violent assault on the US Capitol, the seat of our government, in an attempt to halt the counting of the electoral ballots, an essential step in the peaceful transfer of power in our nation. The mob's sustained assault on the Capitol precipitated an equally unprecedented response, with then Capitol Police Chief Steve Sund issuing an urgent request for MPD to come assist in defending the Capitol. Needless to say, when we received the call for help, MPD responded immediately. Within minutes, our members arrived at a chaotic scene. The violent mob had overran protective measures at the Capitol in an attempted insurrection prior to the arrival of MPD officers at the West Front. Our objectives were to, one, stop the rioters from entering the Capitol building and remove those that were already inside. Two, secure a perimeter so that the Capitol could be cleared for lawmakers. Three, enable Congress to resume their sessions to demonstrate to our country and to the world that our democracy was still intact. And lastly, once the third objective had been accomplished, begin making arrests of anyone violating the law. At 2:22 p.m., a call was convened with, among others, myself, leadership of the U.S. Capitol Police, the National Guard, and the Department of the Army. I was surprised at the reluctance to immediately send the National Guard to the Capitol grounds. In the meantime, by 2:30 p.m., the district had requested additional officers from as far away as New Jersey and issued notice of an emergency citywide curfew beginning at 6 p.m. From that point, it took another 3.5 hours until all rioters were removed from the Capitol. 90 minutes later, at 8 p.m., Congress was able to resume its critical work and fulfill its constitutional duty. Over the course of January the 6th and into the early morning of the 7th, approximately 1,100 MPD members responded to the Capitol. At least 65 MPD members sustained injuries. 5 people lost their lives on January the 6th. As we reflect on that dark day, we offer condolences to all of the grieving families. In closing, I appreciate the opportunity to highlight the heroism of MPD officers who put their lives on the line to protect the Capitol, Congress, and our democracy. But to ensure the continued safety of the district and everyone in it, we must be frank in looking at several critical issues. This assault on the Capitol has exposed weaknesses in the security of the most secure city in the country. The federal police forces in DC will be re-examining their security protocols, given the risk of both foreign and domestic terrorism. As the chief of the district's municipal police force, I must think about our preparations not only for possible attacks, but the daily impact of the changing operations of our federal partners. As they harden targets in the federal enclave, other buildings in the city under MPD jurisdiction may become more likely targets. This concludes my testimony. I am happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much. Mr. Sant.
Good morning, Chairwoman Klobuchar, Ranking Member Blunt, Chairman Peters, and Ranking Member Portman. Thank you for allowing me the opportunity to testify before your 2 committees regarding the attack on the United States Capitol that occurred January 6th. I have been in policing for almost 30 years. The events I witnessed on January 6th was the worst attack on law enforcement and our democracy that I have seen in my entire career. I witnessed insurgents beating police officers with fists, pipes, sticks, bats, metal barricades, and flagpoles. These criminals came prepared for war. They came with their own radio system to coordinate the attack and climbing gear and other equipment to defeat the Capitol's security features. I am sickened by what I witnessed that day. Our officers fought valiantly, using batons, shields, chemical munitions, and pepper ball guns to hold back the attackers. Capitol Police and responding law enforcement agencies showed tremendous restraint by not using their firearms, which would have likely led to a more chaotic situation and a possible mass casualty incident. No civilian law enforcement agency, to include the United States Capitol Police, is trained or equipped to repel an insurrection of thousands of individuals focused on breaching a building at all costs. I am extremely proud and appreciative of the Capitol Police officers, the Metropolitan Police Department, and the other law enforcement agencies that came to our assistance. A clear lack of accurate and complete intelligence across several federal agencies contributed to this event, and not poor planning by the United States Capitol Police. We rely on accurate information from our federal partners to help us develop effective security plans. The intelligence that we based our planning on indicated that the January 6th protests were expected to be similar to the previous MAGA rallies in 2020, which drew tens of thousands of participants. The assessment indicated that members of the Proud Boys, white supremacist groups, Antifa, and other extremist groups were expected to participate on January 6th, and that they may be inclined to become violent. Based on the intelligence that we received, we plan for an increased level of violence at the Capitol, and that some participants may be armed. But none of the intelligence we received predicted what actually occurred. Extensive preparations were put into place for January 6th that included the full activation of the department, intelligence and information sharing with our federal and local partners and department officials, implementing a significant enhancement for member protection, extensive operational enhancements to include significant civil disobedience deployment and an expanded perimeter. We also distributed additional protective equipment for our officers and coordinated outside agency support. As recent as Tuesday, January 5th, during a meeting I hosted with my executive team, the Capitol Police Board, and a dozen of the top law enforcement and military officials from D.C., no entity, including the FBI, provided any new intelligence regarding January 6th. It should be also noted that the Secretary of Homeland Security did not issue an elevated or imminent alert in reference to the events at the United States Capitol on January 6th. We properly planned for a mass demonstration with possible violence. What we got was a military-style coordinated assault on my officers and a violent takeover of the Capitol building. I know that the images we saw of the officers battling for their lives and the visuals on national TV had a profound effect on the nation. The United States Capitol Police did everything we could based on the intelligence and available resources to prepare for this event. While my officers were fighting, my post was in the command center coordinating resources from numerous agencies around the National Capital Region to provide critically needed support. I was also briefing the 2 sergeant-at-arms and working on establishing accountability and priorities for the incoming resources. As Capitol Police and outside resources began to reestablish the security perimeter, I responded to the Capitol building to personally evaluate the situation and brief the sergeant-at-arms and leadership. I acknowledge that under the pressure of an unprecedented attack, a number of systems broke down. One of the reported issues described by officers was a lack of clear communications and directions from officials. It appears that the established incident command for the Capitol building was overwhelmed by the enormity of the situation and as officials battling insurrections as opposed to directing the response. There have also been reports that some officers may have felt confused or let down during the attack. As an official who cares as much as I do about my colleagues, nothing is more painful to me. These issues must be addressed through new training, policies, and procedures. Even our best efforts were not enough to stop this unprecedented assault on the Capitol. However, casting blame solely on United States Capitol Police leadership is not only misplaced, but it also minimizes what truly occurred that day. The focus going forward needs to be on the efforts to improve intelligence and the coordination of security measures between all involved agencies. Hopefully, this will be part of the focus of an independent after-action committee to look at all aspects of the January attack on our nation's Capitol. In closing, I want to again recognize the heroic efforts of the Capitol Police officers, who on January 6th, outnumbered and against the odds, successfully carried out their mission to protect the members of Congress and the legislative process. I couldn't have been more proud to be part of their team and the USCP mission. I'm available to answer any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sund. Mr. Stanger.
Chairwoman Klobuchar, Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Blunt, Ranking Member Portman. The National Capital Region is a unique environment for law enforcement. The U.S. Capitol Police, in conjunction with the sergeants at arms, work to provide security of the Capitol complex and its population. But there is a shared responsibility with other law enforcement groups within the region. Sharing of information and resources is paramount for success. Once assuming the position of the Senate Sergeant at Arms, enhancement of the working relationship between my office and U.S. Capitol Police had been a priority. I am a proponent of the concept of intelligence-led policing. This methodology can be used in assessing threats to individual members as well as threats to the campus. As in all intelligence operations, it is only as good as the analyst assessing it. And that assessment is then placed in the appropriate hands to take steps in order to mitigate any threats. We have to be careful of returning to a time when possibility rather than probability drives security planning. Where the events of January 6th certainly reveal that a review of intelligence should be done. Returning to the concept of possibility driving security operations may result in the poor use of resources. This is the constant give and take of security planning. There is an opportunity to learn lessons from the events of January 6th. Investigations should be considered as to the funding and traveling what appears to be professional agitators. First Amendment rights should always be considered in conjunction with these investigations. Law enforcement coordination in the National Capital Region should be reviewed to determine what can be done in a more efficient and productive manner. Intelligence collection and dissemination, training, and concepts on the use of force must be consistent. This integration should be accomplished without regard to self-interest and cost. In conclusion, whenever you prepare for a major event, just always consider the possibility of some level of civil disobedience at these demonstrations and plan accordingly. Events of January 6th went beyond disobedience. This was a violent, coordinated attack with a loss of life could have been much worse. This concludes my prepared remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Stenger. Mr. Irving.
Chairman Peters, Chairwoman Klobuchar, Ranking Member Portman, Ranking Member Blunt, and distinguished members of the committees. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. There's been a lot of press reporting about me, not all of it accurate, and I appreciate the opportunity to address some of that today. My name is Paul Irving, and I served as the Sergeant at Arms for the House of Representatives for the past 9 years. Serving in that role was one of the great honors of my life, and I count it a privilege to have worked with speakers from both political parties, including Speaker Boehner, Speaker Ryan, and Speaker Pelosi. I'm a law enforcement officer by training. My professional career started more than 40 years ago as an intern at the Department of Justice, and then as a clerk at the FBI. I later became a special agent at the Secret Service, where I worked on 2 different presidential protection details and ultimately rose to the rank of assistant director. Like you, I am profoundly saddened by the events of January 6th. The entire world witnessed horrific acts of violence and destruction carried out by our very own citizens against the global symbol of democracy, our seat of government. I am particularly saddened by the loss of life, which included 3 officers. My heart goes out to all the families that lost a loved one. We began planning for the protests of January 6th in December 2020. The planning relied on what we understood to be credible intelligence provided by various state and federal agencies, including a special event assessment issued by the Capitol Police on January 3rd. The January 3rd assessment forecast that the protests were, quote, expected to be similar to the previous million MAGA March rallies that had taken place in November and December 2020. Every Capitol Police daily intelligence report between January 4 and January 6th, including on January 6th, forecast the chance of civil disobedience or arrest during the protests as remote to improbable. I relied on that intelligence when overseeing the security plan put forth by Chief Son. The Chief's plan took on an all-hands-on-deck approach whereby every available sworn Capitol Police employee with police powers was assigned to work on January 6th. That meant approximately 1,200 Capitol Police officers were on site, including civil disturbance units and other tactical teams. I also understood that 125 National Guard troops were on notice to be standing by for a quick response. The Metropolitan Police Department was also on 12-hour shifts with no officers on day off or leave, and they staged officers just north of the Capitol to provide immediate assistance if required. The plan was briefed to multiple law enforcement partners. Based on the intelligence, we all believed that the plan met the threat and that we were prepared. We now know that we had the wrong plan. As one of the senior security leaders responsible for the event, I am accountable for that. I accept that responsibility, and as you know, I have resigned my position. Much has been said about whether optics affected my judgment in a January 4 telephone call with Chief Sund and Senate Sergeant at Arms Stenger about a National Guard offer to incorporate 125 unarmed National Guard troops into the security plan. The Guard's purpose would have been to work traffic control near the Capitol. My use of the word optics has been mischaracterized in the media. Let me be clear. Optics, as portrayed in the media, played no role whatsoever in my decisions about security, and any suggestion to the contrary is false. Safety was always paramount when making security plans for January 6th. We did discuss whether the intelligence warranted having troops at the Capitol. That was the issue, and the collective judgment at that time was no, the intelligence did not warrant that. If the chief or any other security leader had expressed doubt about our readiness without the National Guard, I would not have hesitated to request them. Chief Sund, Senate Sergeant at Arms Stenger, and I were confident in the chief's plan, and I did whatever I could to ensure that Chief Sund had the support needed to prepare and execute that security plan. And on January 6th, when I was asked for authorization to request National Guard assistance, I approved it. There are important lessons to be learned from January 6th. I commend the committees for conducting this proactive review of the events leading up to and on January 6th. I want to help the staff and members make changes and improvements and to ensure the tragedies of January 6th never occur again. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much. We'll now begin questioning. I want to start out just to clear up one thing by just asking all of our witnesses a yes/no question. Based on what we know now, including the recent Department of Justice indictment, do you agree that there is now clear evidence that supports the conclusion that the January 6th insurrection was planned and it was a coordinated attack on the U.S. Capitol? Just say, everyone agree?
Yes.
Okay. Would you agree that this attack involved white supremacists and extremist groups?
Yes.
Okay. Would you agree that this was a highly dangerous situation, which was horrific, but could have actually been worse without the courage of the officers that you commanded?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you.
Yes.
Okay, so now let's look at what we knew leading up to it, or what you knew leading up to it, or what people that worked for you knew leading up to it. We knew leading up to it that on leading up to January 6th, President Trump sent nationwide tweets telling people to come to Washington on January 6th and saying, "Be there, will be wild." And according to public reporting by the Washington Post, the FBI's Norfolk Field Office issued a threat report on January 5th that detailed specific calls for violence online in connection with January 6th, including that protesters, quote, "be ready to fight," end quote, and quote, "go there ready for war," end quote. I guess I'll start with you, Mr. Sund. When a critical intelligence report is received by the Capitol Police from an intelligence community source like the FBI, who usually would receive it? And I guess I'll start with, did you receive this report?
Thank you very much for the question, ma'am. I actually, just in the last 24 hours, was informed by the department that they actually had received that report. It was received by what we call one of our sworn members that's assigned to the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which is a task force with the FBI. They received it the evening of the 5th, reviewed it, and then forwarded over to an official at the intelligence division over at U.S. Capitol Police Headquarters.
And so you hadn't seen it yourself?
No, ma'am. It did not go any further than that.
Okay, and then was it sent to the House and Senate Sergeant at Arms?
I don't believe it went any farther than from the over to the sergeant at the intelligence division.
Okay, and Mr. Irving, Mr. Stenger, did you get that report beforehand? Mr. Stenger, did you get the report?
No.
Okay, Mr. Irving.
I did not.
Okay. Okay, so I think that may have contributed part to the lack of information, but I'll leave that for the future. Now let's go back to another report. I know on January 3rd, Mr. Sund, you said in your written testimony that the Capitol Police published intelligence assessments of the event, including one on January 3rd. Do you mostly rely on your federal partners like the FBI to gather and analyze intelligence on potential threats to the Capitol and members of Congress?
Yes, I think what's important to realize as a law enforcement agency, we're a consumer of intelligence and information that's provided by the intelligence community. The intelligence community is 18 federal agencies that collect information, do the analyzing of the raw data, raw intelligence, and then provide it to us. So we're reliant on that information to be complete and accurate.
But in that report, we now know, according to your testimony, that tens of thousands of participants were likely to descend on Washington. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And the January 3rd memo, according to the Washington Post, made clear that supporters of President Trump see January 6th as the last opportunity to overturn the results of the presidential election, and that, quote, this sense of desperation and disappointment may lead to more of an incentive to become violent. Is that correct?
Yes, it is, ma'am.
The article also quoted the memo as stating that unlike previous post-election protests, the targets of the pro-Trump supporters are not necessarily the counter-protesters, but rather Congress itself is the target on the 6th. Is that right?
That is correct.
And did you have any indication that many of these protesters might arrive armed or that members of extremist groups might be there?
We knew that members of extremist groups would be there, and there was social media calls for people to come armed, yes.
You've also said that at a January 5th meeting with Capitol Police, the Sergeant-at-Arms and federal law enforcement, military officials, all present at the meeting indicated that there was no new intelligence to report for January 6th. Is that right?
That is correct, ma'am.
But your testimony states that the Capitol Police took a number of steps after these assessments, like what you said was the largest number of civil disturbance unit platoons possible, increasing dignitary protection coverage, coordinating with the D.C. police, and ordering all hands-on-deck status for Capitol Police. Is that right?
That is correct, ma'am. We took extensive efforts to prepare for the events based on the information, much of which you just reviewed, yes.
Okay, good. So if the information was enough to get you to do that, why didn't we take some additional steps? Why didn't you and others involved to be better prepared to confront the violence?
We expanded our perimeter. When we expanded the perimeter, again, we knew there was going to be some maybe limited violence, but we did. We expanded the perimeter. We took a number of steps to outfit our personnel with additional hard gear. We developed a plan for if we had protesters that may be armed. And that was one of the reasons, the expanded perimeter and the heightened risk, that I went to the Sergeant-at-Arms and requested the National Guard.
But now you realize it wasn't enough, those security measures. Is that right?
Well, that is, you know, hindsight being what it is. I mean, you look around the Capitol right now and you see the resources that are brought to bear based on the information we now know from January 6th.
Okay. Mr. Sun, you stated in your written testimony that you first made a request for the Capitol Police Board to declare an emergency and authorize National Guard support on Monday, January 4th, and that request was not granted.
That is correct, ma'am.
Your testimony makes clear that the current structure of the Capitol Police Board resulted in delays in bringing in assistance from the National Guard. Would you agree with that? That's one of the things we want to look at.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Do you think that changes are needed to make clear that the Capitol Police Chief has the authority to call in the National Guard?
I certainly do. I think in exigent circumstances, there needs to be a streamlined process for the Capitol Chief of Police, for the Capitol Police to have authority.
Okay. And Mr. Stanger, do you think that reforms are needed to the structure of the Capitol Police Board to make that clear?
I think a review of the Capitol Police Board and their statutory authority is probably would be a good time to do this now. There's a lot of statutes out there in the Capitol Police Board that go back many, many years. Things have changed, and it's probably to make the board a little bit more nimble. It's probably not a bad time and an idea to take a look at what's there.
It's probably an understatement with what happened, but thank you. Mr. Irving, your views?
I would certainly agree with both Chief Sund and Michael Stanger. I think a review would certainly be warranted at this time of the Capitol Police Board.
Mr. Sund, your written testimony states that you had no authority to request the assistance of the National Guard without an emergency declaration of the Capitol Police Board. On what rule, regulation, or authority did you base that view?
I'd have to go back and look the specific rule, but it's a standing rule that we have. I cannot request the National Guard without a declaration of emergency from the Capitol Police Board. It's kind of interesting because it's very similar to the fact, I can't even give my men and women cold water on an excessively hot day without a declaration of emergency. It's just a
Okay.
process that's in place.
And to be clear, apart from the Capitol Police Board, you also faced delays in getting authorization to bring in the National Guard from the Department of Defense. Is that correct? We'll be hearing from them next week.
Yes, ma'am, that is correct.
Would you agree that there were serious issues at the Pentagon that contributed to the fact that Guard troops did not arrive at the Capitol until about 5:40 that day after most of the violence had subsided?
I don't know what issues there were at the Pentagon, but I was certainly surprised at the delays I was hearing and I was seeing.
Okay, very good. And my last question, just as of all of you, in addition to the reforms of the police board, which are very clear need to be made, any other suggestions that wouldn't involve classified information you have for us, Mr. Sund?
As reference to some of the recommendations, I would look at, again, one of the big things that I think was a contributing factor to this was intelligence. I think as you meet with the intelligence community and law enforcement in the intelligence community, we have a very good relationship. I think the aperture just needs to be opened up a little bit farther. Like Chief Conte had mentioned, January 6th was a new day. It was a change of what threat we face, and I think getting them to open the aperture and looking a little bit harder. And I think internally, looking at some of our policies, procedures, our processes for how we handle special events, how we handle incident command, was stuff we can do. And then looking at physical security of the building and the grounds, I think is going to be critical. I know a lot of people have talked about, the fencing, the open environment. I understand, and I know that goes way back, and members of Congress like the open environment. I think there are ways to develop a more secure campus while keeping an open environment, but I'll leave that for more classified or restricted hearings.
Okay, thank you. Anything you would add in addition, just any other thing you'd add in addition to what the former police chief laid out here, Mr. Stanger?
I would be very supportive of those areas that the chief mentioned. I think he's right on the money there. I think there's maybe another area of use of force that probably needs to be coordinated better in the region here. But certainly intelligence needs to be taken a look at as to how
Okay.
it works. We have a lot of people that we've ramped up since 9/11. And I think maybe it's time to take a look at how efficient it is on the gathering of intelligence and the collection of intelligence.
Okay. Thank you. I'm going to allow my colleagues to ask that same question of you, Mr. Irving, and you, Chief Conte, because I've gone over my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Sund, you've made or brought up the issue of intelligence throughout your testimony and the gaps that were there and how we need to strengthen the intelligence. But I was struck by the fact that you said the FBI report, and my understanding is that report had some fairly specific information that was troubling. That you said that report did get sent to the Capitol Police, that it went to the folks in the Intelligence Department, but then you were not aware of it, which raises a really big question. It's something coming in like that right before an event that I think is significant. It does not get to operational commanders who are there to deal with it. How can that happen? How can you not get that vital intelligence on the eve of what's going to be in a major event?
What? Thank you, sir. I know that's something that's going to be looked at. I think that information would have been helpful to be aware of. Again, looking at the information for the first time yesterday, it is strictly raw data. It's raw intelligence information that has come in, seen on a social media post. Lots of people postings on social media that need to be, corroborated and confirmed. So again, it's coming in as raw data. So please keep that in mind. But I agree that's something we need to look at. What's the process and how do we streamline that information getting to where it needs to go?
Well, I understand it's raw data, but it's the eve of the event. You're not going to have time to do the kind of analysis that you would normally like to do. That is information that has to get to you. So that's clearly a major problem. And My question is also related to the report that was put out by Capitol Police, by your intelligence folks on January 3rd. The Intelligence Division of the Capitol Police issued a internal report which reportedly stated, and this is some of this has been out in the public domain, that instead of targeting protesters, as you've seen in the prior events that occurred that you've referenced earlier, that, quote, this is quote that has been out in the public domain, that Congress itself is the target on the 6th by Trump supporters. Congress was the target. The report also mentioned that members of the Proud Boys, white supremacist groups, other extremist groups would be in attendance and, quote, again out in public sources, may be inclined to become violent. So you have your own report. Did you see that report that was put out on the 3rd?
Yes, I did.
So how is not that a warning of some extraordinary measures? Now, I understand you increased and you had folks there and you increased your presence. But how is that not a real big warning flag? And if it was, what exactly did you do when you read that report?
So that was one of the reports that contributed to the fact that we expanded our perimeter. I reached out, looking at it, I'd reach out to the Metropolitan Police Department, just knowing, even before that report, knowing, what that extremists were likely to be there. In the previous reports for it, that has been called for on social media for people to be armed. In talking with our partners over at the Metropolitan Police Department, I reached out to say, hey, you're going to be able to provide us some support, and we coordinated that additional support the morning of the 6th. So, yeah, we did take all that in consideration as we developed the extensive security plans for this event.
So you changed plans on January 3rd after getting that report?
We adjust our perimeter. We did a number of things. We actually were adjusting our perimeter probably a little bit before that as well.
So that was happening before. So we're going to want to know more specifically when you get that. And then, of course, I think we're going to see you got additional information from the FBI, for example, but that did not get to you. So
Right.
I understand that.
Yeah.
The other thing that I think is important for us to understand, and I've heard all of you mention this in your testimony, that this was not just it was actually in response to Chairwoman's Klobuchar's question. It is not just a random violent attack. It was actually coordinated that you saw, and I believe in your testimony as well. I'm going to ask other witnesses to respond to this too, because all of you mentioned that. How do you define coordinated? What did we actually see from these folks that leads you to believe that it was coordinated? And I think in your testimony now you just mentioned military-style coordination. So that would mean command and control. It would mean understanding the layout of the Capitol. It may mean knowing the internal operations of defense perimeters, of folks that are engaged. Talk to me, what did you see that leads you to believe that this was a coordinated attack? And I would like our other witnesses to engage in that as well.
Yeah, I'm able to provide you a quick overview of why I think it was a coordinated attack. One, these people came specifically with equipment. You're bringing climbing gear to a demonstration. You're bringing explosives. You're bringing chemical spray, such as what Captain Mendoza had talked about. You're coming prepared. The fact that the group that attacked our West Front, attacked our West Front approximately 20 minutes before the event over at the Ellipse ended, which means they were planning on our agency not being at what they call full strength, watching the other event, saying, hey, that event's ending, okay, everybody get on post, they're going to be marching our way, knowing that we may not be at full strength at that time. And then also the fact that we were dealing with 2 pipe bombs that were specifically, set right off the edge of our perimeter to, what I suspect, draw resources away. I think there was a significant coordination with this attack.
Anyone else? Chief Conte, I think you also believed it was a coordinated attack?
Oh, absolutely. My view is from the day of the incident. I think there were hand signals that were being used by several of the insurrectionists. There was radio communication by several individuals that were involved. The coordinated use of chemical munitions to include bear spray by several people that were out there. I certainly believe it was coordinated. To Chief Sun's point regarding the placement of the pipe bombs in the areas, their discovery prior to this event, all of those things. And plus, adding to that what we know in hindsight now as a result of the ongoing investigation that's being handled by the FBI, as they continue to scrub social media, I think we're learning more and more and more that this was clearly a coordinated effort.
Real quick, Mr. Irving, and then I'll ask another question real quick, Mr. Irving.
Based on the information provided by Chief Conte and Chief Sund, I would agree the evidence would indicate a coordinated attack.
So we're looking at folks that were coming out in intelligence reports, that groups like the Oath Keepers, Proud Boys, others that were engaged, these violent extremist groups, which we clearly need to collect more intelligence on. It'll be the subject of another hearing that we will do regarding this. But if you look at what the DOJ is now prosecuting, 200 federal cases. The FBI has linked at least 40 to extremist groups, 59 to other defendants that have connections on social media to violent or extremist rhetoric, conspiracy theories. This is clearly an area that we've got to focus on as to why did we not have more information about these groups that were coming here planning, and usually you leave a trail when you're planning, either that or you're real sophisticated using encrypted devices and other things, but those are things that we're going to have to be looking at. Clearly, the National Guard presence was critical. I know you're going to get a lot of questions related to that, but Chief Conte, in my remaining time, just a question. Yeah, and you mentioned this in your testimony, but in an earlier statement, Chief, you stated that you were stunned by quote, the tepid response of the Army officials in response to Chief Sund's request for assistance while the violent siege was escalating. Clearly, here we got a coordinated attack. All of you saw this immediately the way they were doing. I can imagine the conversations with the National Guard. And Chief, you were stunned by the tepid response. Could you clarify that and tell us exactly how those conversations went?
Yeah, so just after, sometime after 2:00 p.m., I had left the west front of the Capitol after initially being at the scene, assessing what was going on, looking at just how violent, looking at the violent actions that were taking place. Shortly thereafter, there was a phone call that was convened between several officials. Chief Sund was on the call, literally pleading there were several Army officials that were on the call. I don't know all by name who were on the call. Several officials from district government that were on the scene. Chief Sund was pleading for the deployment of the National Guard. And in response to that, there was not an immediate yes. The National Guard is responding. Yes, the National Guard is on the way. Yes, the National Guard are being restaged from traffic posts to respond. The response was more asking about the plan, what was the plan for the National Guard? The response was more focused on, in addition to the plan, the optics, how this looks with boots on the ground on the Capitol. And in my response to that was simply, I was just stunned that, I have officers that were out there literally fighting for their lives. And, we're kind of going through, what seemed like an exercise to really check the boxes. And there was not an immediate response. When I asked specifically, Chief Sund, was he requesting the National Guard, and was that request being denied? The response was no, we're not, from the U.S. Department of the Army was no, we're not denying the request, but they were concerned, they did have concerns. So I was just stunned at that response.
Thank you. Senator Blunt.
Thank you, Chairman. Chief Sund, if I have your testimony correct this morning, I think what I'm hearing you say is based on the intelligence you saw on January the 3rd, after that on January the 4th, you decided this was going to be a different kind of protest than you'd seen in November and December, and that's when you asked for an expanded perimeter and National Guard assistance. Is that correct?
So the information we received, yes, it was very similar to the previous assessments. It was just a little bit more detailed. We had been analyzing kind of how we responded to the previous MAGA marches and decided to expand the perimeter. Really, when you expand a perimeter as large as we expanded it, it creates a large area you have to defend. And that was the primary reason, knowing that these protesters were coming here. We were the focus of the protest and the expanded perimeter, and we knew this was going to be a long day.
So did you know from the time you expanded the perimeter that you were going to have more help in all likelihood to defend that perimeter than your force would be able to provide?
We knew the additional support would be, we could utilize the additional support, yes.
So why did you believe that you needed the approval of Mr. Irving and Mr. Stinger to request assistance to the National Guard?
That's always been the case. We only requested the National Guard for very specific events, usually the inauguration, and that requires a declaration of emergency from the Capitol Police Board to utilize those resources.
Do you know if there's a statutory requirement for that?
I could look into that and get that to you as a follow-up if you'd like.
I don't know that there is, but I do know that if you get the approval to expand the perimeter and you don't have the assistance to do that, that's obviously a problem. Why didn't you contact the third member of the police board, the architect of the Capitol, Mr. Blanton?
Thank you for that question, sir. My conduit to the Capitol Police Board was usually through the House and Senate Sergeant Arms. They were the ones usually having the communications with the department, especially law enforcement related issues. They're both law enforcement, and also the fact that Mr. Stinger at the time is the Capitol Police Board chairperson. But usually outside the monthly Capitol Police Board meeting that we'd have, unless it was a issue specific to the architect regarding building structure, something like that, my conduit was regularly the House and Senate Sergeant Arms.
Why do you think the architect of the Capitol's on the police board?
As one of the voting members and providing oversight.
But apparently not enough oversight that you thought you needed to involve him in the conversation.
Like I said, my usual conduit was going through the House and Senate Sergeant Arms. That's already 2 people I got to go to, going to 3. In the future, I guess if that's something that's going to be, that we'll implement, then I will implement it. But I was just following my usual course of action.
So Mr. Irving and Mr. Stinger both, let's start with Mr. Irving. Why was the request for National Guard assistance not approved at the same time you approved the expansion of the perimeter? Mr. Irving? I think you're muted, Mr. Irving. Now you're definitely muted. Okay, now you should be fine. Go ahead.
Am I okay now?
You're okay
Yes.
now.
Thank you. I apologize for that. Senator, I did not take the call from Chief Sund on the 4th as a request. Chief Sund called me to tell me that he had received an offer from the National Guard to provide us 125 unarmed troops to work traffic control in the perimeter of the Capitol. Shortly after that discussion, I said, let's include Sergeant at Arms Stanger as chair of the board and another senior official with quite a bit of experience. The 3 of us talked it through. And during that call, the number 1 question on the table was, did the intelligence support it? Did the intelligence support that additional offer for those 125 troops?
Did you discuss this with anybody except Sergeant Arms Stanger and Chief Sund?
No, it was just this one phone call. And during that call, we all agreed that the intelligence did not support the troops and collectively decided to let it go. Michael Stenger then said, how about we put them on standby just in case, and that's what we ended up doing. But from what I remember, everyone was very satisfied that we had a robust plan, security plan, that was consistent with the intelligence that we had at the time.
Mr. Stinger, why did you think that the troops were on standby? They must have been standing way away from where we needed them if it took hours to get them here. What did that mean they were going to be on standby?
What I did when I spoke to the chief, when the chief brought up to me this attempt to get the National Guard, and it apparently wasn't going forward, I suggested to him that he reach out. He knew the National Guard commander from his previous work in the Metropolitan Police Department. And I suggested that he reach out to the National Guard commander for a couple of reasons. One of them was I had either read in the paper or heard on the news that the National Guard in D.C. was rather reticent to engage with demonstrations this time because of the issues that had arisen during the White House demonstrations of a month ago, and that we need to make sure that the National Guard was engaged in this and that they would be willing to.
Well, do you think you did make sure that they were engaged and would be willing? I'm going to have to go to one more question here. Did you think they were engaged and would be willing if called on?
Yeah, that's what I think, what I asked the
right.
chief to determine from the general.
All right, Mr. Irving, you said in your testimony that when asked for National Guard assistance, you approved it. Mr. Sun stated that he asked for the National Guard assistance at 1:09, and you approved, it was approved at 2:10. Why would it take an hour to approve National Guard assistance on your part in that moment of crisis? Mr. Irving.
Senator, from my recollection, I did not receive a request for approval for National Guard until shortly after 2 p.m. when I was in Michael Stanger's
All right,
office.
let me get that straightened out. Mr. Sun, do you know when you asked for National Guard assistance? Was it 1:09 or was it 2 p.m.?
It was 109, sir.
1:09, and who did you ask for assistance at 1:09?
It was from Mr. Irving. I believe he was in the company of Mr. Stanger at the time as well.
And Mr. Irving, why would you not remember that?
Senator, I have no recollection of a conversation with Chief Sund. At that time, I was on the floor during the Electoral College session, and my conversation with Chief Sund in that time frame was shortly before 1:30, when I recall he was describing conditions outside as deteriorating. He may in fact be submitting a request, and I carried that forward, and that was as much as I can tell you. I have no phone record of a call from Chief Sund.
Did you discuss that request at 1:09 or whenever you got it with anybody else, or did you and Mr. Stanger make that decision then?
No, I did not get a request at 1:09 that I can remember. The first conversation I had with Chief Sund in that time frame was at 1:28, 1:30, and in that conversation, he indicated that conditions were deteriorating. He might be looking for National Guard approval and approval of our mutual aid agreements with local law enforcement. And I went to Mike Stanger's office awaiting an update.
Well, this is a time, Mr. Irving, I'm sure my colleagues will want to follow up on this because I'm out of time, but that's a time when the difference in 1:30 and 2:10 or 1:09 and 2:10 makes a big difference. One of the things I'm wondering, and we don't have time for you to answer this, but I'm going to tell you what I'm thinking here, is in a moment like this, if your focus is chiefly on the safety of House members, and I would certainly understand that, and Mr. Stanger's is chiefly on the safety of Senate members, maybe that's a problem here where the board really can't function as a board because you have such diverse areas of immediate responsibility. But whatever happened here doesn't seem to me to be in agreement with the various timeframes, and I'm out of time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Blunt. And I wanted, Senator Peters and I are going to trade off chairing here with the votes, and we have a set order that all the senator's staff have based on a melded set of rules between the two committees. And I'd like to submit for the record a written statement from the United States Capitol Police Labor Committee dated February 23rd, 2021. Thank you. Senator Portman.
Without objection, Ranking Member Portman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, with regard to the conversation we just had on the discrepancies with regard to National Guard assistance, I would request that both Chief Sund, you and Mr. Irving provide us with those phone records. I know there's been some interviews that have been conducted, but I'm not sure we have the phone records, and that that would clear up some of the confusion. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about preparedness. Chief Sund, in your testimony, you talked about the need for better intelligence and better coordination. That was your conclusion. And I think that's true. And certainly everything we have learned indicates that was part of the problem. But what about preparedness? We've received information that prior to January 6th, Capitol police officers were not trained on how to respond to an infiltration of the Capitol building. Is that correct, Mr. Zund?
When you talk about infiltration, you talk about a large insurrection like we saw on the January 6th? No.
And why not? Why wouldn't we be prepared for an infiltration of the Capitol? Given the risk that's out there, I would say to Mr. Irving and Mr. Stenger, both of you have had distinguished careers with the Secret Service. I would ask you all to just give me a quick yes or no answer. Does the Secret Service have training regarding infiltration as an example of the White House? Yes or no? Mr. Stenger? Mr. Irving?
Senator?
I'll take that as a yes. If it's a
Yes.
no, okay. Mr. Stenger, are you a yes also?
Yes.
Okay. Well, it seems obvious that you would have training on responding to an infiltration. So I think if nothing else comes out of this process, we've got to figure out how to deal with, again, the real danger that is out there, and it seems to me the intelligence reports, but also just the previous demonstrations would indicate a need for that kind of training. Let me ask you about something else, if I could, Mr. Sun, and that has to do with the U.S. Capitol Police officers that I saw on video and the world saw fighting against this attack in street uniforms or soft uniforms. Many of them did not have riot gear. I'm told by contrast, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department provides all of its officers with such gear, including helmets, shields, gloves, gas masks. Having seen those incredibly disturbing videos and photographs of your brave officers attempting to hold the line to defend the Capitol without that kind of riot gear, are all Capitol Police officers outfitted with riot gear?
No, they are not, sir.
They're not. And why are they not?
So if you look at the way we outfit our officers, and it'll probably be very similar to, I think you'll find even with Metropolitan, I've been with Metropolitan for a number of years, they'll have a certain number of officers, CDU platoons as they call. It's not the entire force that's outfitted to the level 1 CDU with the big protective gear, the helmets, things like that. So we outfit a number of we have 7 CDU platoons that we can activate. 4 of those platoons, it's 40 people in a platoon, are activated to what we call the level 1, the full CDU gear and equipment. It requires extensive costs, extensive training to keep and maintain that level. For us, a number of our officers are posted in interior posts, screening posts, things like that, where that gear wouldn't do them any suffice, wouldn't provide them any support. So we have determined up till January 6th that number of CDU platoons had sufficed for all the demonstrations that we had been dealing with on Capitol grounds.
Mr. Sund, I would just say, obviously those officers who you say had interior posts needed it that day. So it's not accurate to say that they didn't need it. But I know that you activated 7 of these civil disturbance unit platoons, and that only 4 of them had riot gear. I don't know why you would have a civil disturbance unit platoon that didn't have riot gear, but you've just testified that that's true, that only 4 of them had it. Is that correct?
That is correct. And just one additional point, since I've been chief, I've actually pushed for every member in the department to have riot helmets. I had ordered those back in September. That we had been looking at delays because of COVID from the manufacturer getting them delivered, and they actually just started being delivered January 4th and distributed to our officers just days before this, with limited numbers being given to the officers prior to this event.
Yeah, too late for many of those officers. Chief Conte, the comment was made that Metropolitan Police does not all have riot gear. Is that true? I thought that the Metropolitan Police Department officers did have access to riot gear. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, so we have 7 platoons that have the hardened gear, but all of our officers have ballistic helmets. All of our officers have batons. All of our officers are deployed with gloves as well, and gas masks. So our entire department are deployed with that level. But when you're talking about the harden all of the other extras, we have 7 platoons that have the additional. That's a different layer of protection.
But every officer has a helmet. Every officer has the protective gloves. Every officer has the baton. Is that correct?
And gas mask, that is
And
correct.
gas mask. Yeah. It appeared to the Metropolitan Police Department, I'm told, that the Capitol Hill police officers did not have the training in civil disturbance tactics that they had. That's what I was told by some of the interviews that we've had. Chief Conte, is that correct?
Yes, I've heard the same thing with respect to the training of the U.S. Capitol Police officers.
Are all of your Metropolitan Police officers trained in civil disturbance tactics?
We have platoons that are trained for every for every patrol district and special operations division. Some officers do not have the civil disturbance training. Those officers generally they work traffic duties or they work assignments back in patrol.
Chief Sund, are
If I
all...
could add, they get it coming up. If I could add to one other
Yes.
thing, all of our officers who leave the training academy, they get the basic civil disturbance unit training. So all of our officers do get the basic training, but we might have some members, for example, who've been on for 30 years and they haven't been CDU trained and they may work, back at a patrol district, but all of our members coming out the academy, they receive the civil disturbance unit training.
Mr. Sund, is that true with Capitol Hill police officers also? Are they all trained in civil disturbance tactics as they go through their training?
That was a process being implemented. I could check and let you know if that's been fully implemented for new recruits coming out of the academy. That was one of the initiatives I was working on.
So we were working on that, but as far as you know, this training was not being provided even for new officers, much less for those on the
I believe
force. Is that
I
correct?
believe the new officers coming out were, but I just need to confirm that.
Yeah, I think the bottom line here is that, unfortunately, our officers were not given the proper training with regard to infiltration of the building or the complex, with regard to dealing with civil disturbance, and they didn't have the equipment necessary to push back and, most importantly, to protect themselves. So my hope is that, again, one of the ways that this joint hearing and this committee report